Okay, tonight we will hear from Judy Heumann, an internationally recognized disability advocate.
She's from Brooklyn.
From Brooklyn, Rabbi Weiss. I'm going to give the formal bio, and then we're just going to watch a short clip of your work, Judy, for people who didn't get to see the film yet. She served in the Clinton and Obama administration and was a senior fellow at the Ford Foundation. Judy's story was also featured in the documentary Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, a 2020 American award-winning documentary film produced by the Obama Higher Ground Production. In 2020, she published her memoir, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist written with Kristen Joyner. There's also a young adult version called Rolling Warrior. Judy is now the producer of The Human Perspective, a podcast and YouTube channel that aims to share the beauty of the disability community. I'm going to watch a brief clip, Judy, and then we'll come right back.
Judy lost the use of her legs after a childhood bout with polio and became an activist on her very first day of school.
The principal denied me entrance into the school because I couldn't walk, and he said I could be a fire hazard.
As an adult, she took the same school district to court when she was banned from teaching, and she won, becoming the first wheelchair user to teach in New York City. When President Nixon vetoed legislation protecting the disabled, once again, Judy was ready to fight.
There we were, 50 of us,
right,
from Brooklyn and Queens and Manhattan and the Bronx, and we decided, okay, we're gonna shut down the streets.
They were announcing paraplegics stop traffic in Manhattan, and the police went and got a representative from Nixon headquarters, and they wanted to know what we wanted.
What they wanted was equal rights under the law and a little respect.
We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. And I would appreciate it if you would stop shaking your head in agreement when I don't think you understand what we are talking about.
President Nixon signed the Rehabilitation Act into law in 1973, but didn't establish the tools to enforce it. So Judy led an occupation of the federal building in San Francisco that lasted 25 days. That led Nixon to require states to comply with the law, and the modern disability rights movement was born.
I can tell you that every time you raise issues of separate but equal, the outrage of disabled individuals across the country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited. There will be more takeovers of buildings until finally maybe you begin to understand our position.
Judy didn't stop there. She continued her advocacy, working with Presidents Clinton and Obama on issues like special education and disability rights. She's written a memoir about her life and her work called Being Human, and was featured in the documentary Crip Camp about the groundbreaking summer camp she and many other disability activists attended as teens.
The camp really allowed us to begin to fantasize what we wanted the world to look like, and then also began to question why things weren't happening.
Judy Heumann, activist, author, and hell on wheels.
Disabled people are feeling prouder and speaking up, recognizing that disability is a part of who they are. There you go. You learned it here.
Okay, I discovered Judy by accident, and I really thank God for that opportunity, because Judy is a change-making hero. And how often in our life do we get to meet and learn from heroes? During COVID, I was trying to find something to watch on Netflix, and I stumbled across Crip Camp, in which Judy and her work are prominently featured. Some of us have already watched it, but for those who haven't, and I strongly encourage you to, here's a short description of the camp to entice you to watch it. In the early 1970s, teenagers with disabilities faced a future shaped by isolation, discrimination, and institutionalization. Camp Jened, a ramshackle camp for the handicapped, a term no longer used, in the Catskills, exploded those confines. Jened was their freewheeling utopia, a place with summertime sports, smoking, and makeout sessions awaiting everyone. And campers experienced liberation and full inclusion as human beings. Their bonds endured as many migrated west to Berkeley, California, a hotbed of activism where friends from Camp Jened realized that disruption, civil disobedience, I'm looking at you, Rabbi Weiss, and political participation could change the future for millions. Watching this film was absolutely breathtaking for me. I learned so much. I never realized how much I didn't know about this area, and I felt so deeply. I was incredibly inspired by you, Judy, and watching you develop as a leader. And I thought, oh my God, our students need to learn with you. They need to learn from you. And I said, oh, what a perfect occasion, the Herb Lieberman Award for Community Service. Herb, who's Steve's father, he'll share more about him later, but he gave tirelessly of himself to the community and was a fierce activist. And furthermore, the yeshiva's increasing focus on disabilities, the timing couldn't be better. So Judy, welcome. We're honored to be with you, and I'm privileged to have this conversation with you.
Thank you.
Judy.
Let me add one little thing to that presentation. One teeny correction,
Please.
which was when the regulations were signed, it was during the Carter administration. Nixon had resigned in '74, and Ford had refused to sign the regulations that had been worked on for a number of years and had gone through an official federal review. So it should say Carter instead of Nixon. And the other point that I want to make, and maybe it'll come up in a question, but yeah, let's just go to questions.
Okay. What was it like to be a kid in a wheelchair in the late, I don't quite remember your age, late 50s, early 60s? What did it feel like? Take us through the grade school years. What was schooling like, friends, your Jewish community? Thank you.
So I was born in 1947. I'm 74. It's hard to believe, but I'm 74. And I grew up in Brooklyn. My parents, may the memories be for blessings, were born in Germany. My mother was sent over when she was 12 to live with a distant relative in Chicago who was older, and her kids were all grown. And my dad was 14 and he was sent to live with relatives in Brooklyn. My parents met in Philadelphia. My father, late brother, lived on this street, and my mother had a distant cousin who lived on the same block, and that's how they met. And their relationship was all via mail. I mean, it's really lovely to see this, and including my dad proposing to my mother. My father was in the Marines, and when he was about to be discharged, that's when he met my mom. And, I think like other Jews at that time and just general society, they didn't really know much about disability. There was a lot going on around disabled veterans, non-disabled men and women who had gone to war and came back with disabilities. And there was a big emphasis with groups like Paralyzed Veterans of America. And some of you may have heard of a group called the Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association at that time. They've changed their name since then. But that there were groups like the March of Dimes and United Cerebral Palsy and Muscular Dystrophy and others. But with the exception of the veterans groups, many of the other groups were really medically oriented. They were not really rights-based oriented. And so when my mom took me to school in our neighborhood, when I was 5, she was obviously, like my father, very surprised that they, as the film says, said I couldn't go to school because I was a fire hazard. But the principal said, don't worry, the Board of Ed will send a teacher to the house. So I didn't go to kindergarten. I was in the first, second, third, half of the fourth grade with a teacher coming to the house 2 times a week for a total of 2.5 hours a week. And then I finally started going to school, but it was segregated classes only for disabled children. And it was in a regular public school that went up to the 6th grade. But the disabled kids stayed in the school until they were 21. And then they were going to sheltered workshops. So my mom and a bunch of other mothers who were were realizing that what the Board of Ed really intended was, because none of the high schools were accessible, we were going to go back onto home instruction. So my mother and a bunch of other moms really worked with the Board of Ed to get them to make some high schools accessible. So I was the first student in my special ed class at PS 219 to actually go to high school, a real high school. But I want to just deviate. When I was denied the right to go to school, my mom and dad were looking at the possibility of a Jewish day school. And they found a school, and my mom contacted the school. I guess it was I assume it was reasonably accessible. But my mom wanted to register me and into the 1st grade. And the principal said I didn't know enough Hebrew. So, asking the question of what was it like to be growing up in Brooklyn? So, my parents were trying to get me an education. They didn't understand what was going on when I was denied education in the public school. There were no laws at that point that made that illegal. So although they hadn't been thinking about sending me and my brothers to Jewish day school, they thought, okay. So the principal says, as I said, I didn't know enough Hebrew. So it turned out that the physical therapist that came to the house was Jewish, and his wife was from Israel. So my mother took me multiple times a week in the summer to learn Hebrew. And as the summer was, coming to an end, she contacted the principal to say that she thought I knew enough Hebrew to go into the 1st grade. And what my mother didn't realize at that point was that the principal never expected her to get me taught to speak Hebrew or know some Hebrew. And so when she called and said, I've done what you wanted me to do, of course, he said, oh, no, that's not going to work out. So I think, we were learning a bunch of things. We were learning on some level that being Jews was no different than not, that the same kind of discrimination was going on. And I think that, was an important lesson, because obviously for my family, being Jewish was very important. And they, we were raised as Jews, went to synagogue and blah, blah. But I think that was really, as I got older, it was really an important story. And then another Jewish story was in the 1980s, I moved to California, and the Jewish Weekly had a dating service. And I was interested in applying because they had 2 questions. One is, do you have a disability? Yes, no, choose not to declare. And the other was, would you consider dating someone with a disability? Yes or no? And I answered both questions, and you sent $35, and you were supposed to hear in a couple of weeks, and they were supposed to give you, 3 to 5 names. So that was the first summer that I ever went to Israel. And I was there for like 6 weeks. I had applied in June, and I realized like the end of August, the beginning of September, I never had heard. And then one day I get a letter in the mail, and I open it up, and the check falls out. And the letter says, sorry, there was no one who met my areas of interest. which of course, if I hadn't responded to the questions on disability, probably would have not been true. So I think, for me, one of the issues around being Jewish is recognizing that, as you were saying, a lot of people don't know the story, and a lot of people have biases around disabled people. And so for me, it's been an interesting experience over the last 3-4 decades now to really be working in various ways with the synagogue that I go to, and during February, National Jewish Disability Awareness Month, and seeing the evolution of discussions that are going on in religious institutions around disability, and also the number of disabled rabbis that are, becoming part of the Jewish community, which for me also is a very important sign of things changing. But, growing up, it was this being at home all day when my brothers and neighbors were going to school. But after 3 o'clock, being a part of the community. I played with the neighbors. I went to Hebrew school. I was in Brownies. I took piano lessons. I was doing all these things, but education was something that was so important. But on the other hand, the formal education system itself really was not up to muster at that point.
Tell us about Camp Jened. Like, it seemed from watching the film, there were a lot of Jewish, I don't know if it was staff or camp. Were you a camper, or were you on the staff? Who funded the camp? How did you learn about it? I think you said your friends all came with you, but what was your role there? One scene that really stood out to me was when you were sitting in I think it was the cafeteria, deciding what was going to be for dinner. And I appreciated that that moment. But tell us about the camp and how you learned of it, and was there any Jewish support?
So I originally went to a camp called Oakhurst, which was run by the Jewish Federation and still is in New Jersey. And I think, you kind of aged out at Oakhurst, but the other aspect was this Camp Jened also had longer periods to go to camp. So Oakhurst, you could only go for 3 weeks, and Jened, you could go for 4 weeks or 8 weeks. And so I went to Oakhurst for, I think 4 years, I think 3, and then went to Jened. And I was a camper at Jened. But the year that the footage was taken, I was out of college. I had my lawsuit against the Board of Education when I was denied my job. I had begun to teach, and I was a counselor, part of administration in the year of the film. And the camp, Jened, was not run by the Jewish Federation, but was run by a Jewish family. And so it was a mixed camp. There were a good number of Jewish campers: Neil Jacobson, Denise Jacobson, Shelley Coy, who was one of the administrators, and Shelley's mother and father each had polio, and they'd gone to camp. They had gone to camp. They had an adult camp there. So it was a mixture, but it was a Jewish influence camp because of the owners, but neither Camp Oakhurst nor Camp Jened were Jewish camps. And of course, the Jewish camps weren't, and still more recently have begun to take disabled people into the camps. But that whole summer experience of being in Jewish, like Ramah, Jewish camps where, you know, you were being a camper, but you were also learning about Jewish culture. That was not available.
Okay. So we're going to shift gears now and talk about your activism. How did you know how to do this community organizing and activism? Like no social media, no cell phones. Like, how did you get people to show up? How did you learn those skills? Tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, I think, you know, remember, this started in the 60s and 70s. And you had the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement. So there were lots of movements. You know, the Gray Panthers was emerging. And we were learning by watching what was going on TV and listening to the radio and reading newspapers and being involved on our college campuses with various things. And we used the telephone,
Okay.
that old device. But we had started an organization called Disabled in Action after my lawsuit. And we were, I mean, in some way making it up as we went along, because we weren't a part of most of these other groups. Although I was on student council and was involved, and I was an active member in my sorority. And so, you know, there were many different ways that we were learning. And of course, in the area of disability, not everyone had their disabilities when they were younger. So some of the people that were involved with the movement also had been involved in progressive politics and had been involved in other kinds of anti-war demonstrations. The core group of Disabled in Action and the people at Camp Jeanette were not part of that group. But when you look at the 504 demonstrations, at that point, I had moved, as I said earlier, to Berkeley. And some of the people that were working at the Center for Independent Living were active in other political movements and had been active in organizing. And we meaning people like from Jeanette and others, we very much believed that it was important for us to do cross-disability work. And we did our very best to try to identify other organizations that we could work with. So if you look at New York, for example, when Disabled in Action started, we saw an article in the New York Times one day about an organization that was meeting in Staten Island around Willowbrook. And I'm sure the older people in this room know Willowbrook. Willowbrook School is called Willowbrook School for the mentally retarded. We don't use that word anymore, but that's what it was called. And Geraldo Rivera got his start when doctors inside that hospital basically briefed him on what was going on and gave him keys to come into the hospital or the facility. And so we sent someone to one of their organizing meetings. Now, the people at that meeting did not have disabilities. They were parents who had kids who were living there and doctors and others who were opposing what was going on. And they were, they're very radical in their politics. So, you know, bringing these different groups together was very important because we were learning as we were, you know, doing. And, you know, it didn't take, you know, brain surgeon skills to know that disability, as I said before, Most people don't acquire their disabilities when they were younger, but as they get older. And also that we really did not want this to be a movement which was only looking inward. What we felt was very important was that the broader world needed to understand what was wrong with what was going on, why we needed laws that affected disabled people that were similar to the Civil Rights Act of '64 as an example. And so, you know, when we had the demonstration on Madison Avenue, and that's a very funny story, actually, because Nixon had vetoed, as the piece said, this very important piece of legislation, the Rehabilitation Act, which had as a part of it something called Title V, which was all laws that prohibited discrimination, required affirmative action, all around disability. And we didn't know anything about it until it was vetoed. And then we started organizing. And we brought together the people that we had met in Staten Island and another similar group to DIA in Queens. And we thought, okay, we're gonna go and have a demonstration outside of a federal building in Manhattan. And I think we found the only federal building in the United States, which was on a little area in Manhattan where basically there was no foot traffic and hardly any cars.
Oh.
But we got there, we had made a coffin, we had great posters and handouts about how he was killing all these things, and there was no one there. So we sat in the street, the police were there. And of course, as I said, it didn't really matter because nothing was happening. So one of the police officers said to me, what do you want? And I said, this is honest the truth, where is Nixon headquarters? So he called in and he found out where Nixon headquarters was. And so 50 of us went to Nixon headquarters, which was on Madison Avenue. And that's how we organized that, very spontaneously. Then that Monday, we had another demonstration walking against traffic on Times Square, but we had decided that one of the reasons we weren't getting press coverage is we had no Vietnam veterans. So I randomly called the McGovern campaign and said, we need some disabled veterans. And they got us two disabled veterans. One guy named Bobby Mueller, who was a big time activist and had been involved in Chicago during the Democratic demonstrations in '68. And so, these little things that happen by networking and speaking to people, and you'll see, in Crip Camp, if you watch it, that it was not just demonstrations of disabled people, but there were rallies outside the building, the federal building in San Francisco, almost every day. The first demonstration had a couple of hundred people at it, and we had labor union support, religious community support, the Black Panthers support, anti-war groups, Vietnam vet groups. It was a very broad coalition because over the years out in the Berkeley area, we had really, in many different occasions, been working with these other groups, both to get them to support things that we were trying to do, like make public transportation accessible, as an example, dealing with budgets for the city or the county. And so, we were supporting groups in the Asian community, in the Latin American community, the Black community, and also talking with them about how there are disabled people in all these communities. And our theme has always been, put a disability lens on the work that you're doing. If you're not including now in the US 61 million disabled people. And we know more than 1 billion people internationally, at least 15%, but in the US and other Western countries, it's like 22%. So in middle income and poor countries, the numbers are not right yet, but it's high. If you don't understand who the population is and the diversity of the population, then you can't really be fulfilling the work that you need to be doing in whatever the majority of the people are in your group, Jewish, Catholic, Latinos, on and on. And that's really been one of the critical organizing tools that have been being cultivated, nurtured, supported. So you look, for example, at the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is now the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. In 1980, they were doing very little in disability. And now, major disability groups are part of the executive committee for the Leadership Conference. They still have a lot of work that they're learning, but so does the disability community in really continuing to diversify so that we are working on poverty across disability, on and on.
Okay. And we're going to take one question from the audience. Wait, can you see Dimitri? Hold on 1 minute. Dimitri, stand up, stand up. Dimitri is our award winner for the evening, Judy.
Hello.
Hello, thank you so much for being with us. Just have a question for you. How do you feel like your Judaism?
You know what? Can you come closer to the mic?
Sure. Hi. How do you feel like your Judaism has informed your advocacy work? And how in turn do you feel like your advocacy work has informed and potentially transformed your relationship to your Judaism?
I think Judaism has played a very important role for me, like never give up. And knowing, that the world is not perfect. And I have to say that I get emotional on this question. It's been very disappointing over the decades to see how people are learning and things are getting better, but it's still not where it needs to be. And I don't think, I've ever had a crisis of faith. I guess I really believe, that the work that as Jews we're doing within the Jewish community and in the broader community is just a continuation of what we need to be doing to heal the world and make it a better place. But it is disappointing to see how the issue is not embraced enough. And I think, I did an interview with Trevor Noah, and on March 4th, right before the shutdown. And if you watch it, he uses the term, we're having a general discussion, and he uses the term able-bodied, and I hate the word able-bodied. So I said, I don't use the word able-bodied, I use the word non-disabled, because you or someone close to is going to become temporarily or permanently disabled over the course of your life. And he said, are you threatening me? And I was, this was not anything that we rehearsed at all. And my first thought was, interesting word. But then I really thought it is such the right word, because I really believe that people feel threatened. We feel threatened by things that we don't have control over. And certainly in the area of disability, we have certain control, but in other ways we have no control. And I think what the Jewish community, like Jewish Federation and other organizations are coming in and they're doing good work, but in many cases it's changing, but it's still not from a rights-based perspective. And I think that's really one of the fundamental parts of the disability movement itself, is doing this work from a rights-based perspective, that people have the right to live in the community, have the right to be able to get personal assistance, have the right to get many different things in order to be able to benefit and contribute to the communities. And, there was a meeting that I participated in the 80s in LA, where the Jewish Federation brought together a small group of Jews from across the state with representatives from the different sectors of the community to talk about the issue of Judaism and disability. And I have to say that that was an amazing meeting, because it was the first time that I was ever in touch with how angry I was. And I never wanted to express it in the broader community, because as a Jew, I didn't want anybody to have any excuses to say anything anti-Semitic. And it was no different than what other communities were doing. But it was really great to be with a group of Jews who had disabilities, where we could really talk about how difficult it was to want to be a part of a group that didn't necessarily really want us to be a part of the group. And I think while that's definitely getting better, I still feel, and I think, most Jews, observant or not, pretty much would be saying similar things. But as I said, there really is a growing number, a lot of activities that are going on in the Jewish community. The Heumann Foundation, I think, was doing some very good work in this area. And Addis Israel, which is where I go in DC, for a number of years would have a really good speaker who would come during National Jewish Disability Awareness Month. And we did all kinds of things. And you can see some very important changes, like at Addis, it went from being a task force on disability this past year to now becoming a part of the Social Justice Committee. And the leader of the disability group is Rabbi Tuckman, who herself is blind. And, so those things for me are very exciting.
Judy, we're going to close, and now you have an opportunity to charge these future rabbis who are going to transform the Jewish community and beyond. What do you want to say to them?
Read, learn, speak to the disability activists. I'll be happy to give you some names of Jewish rabbis if you don't have them. Really look at what are people saying? What do people want? How do we keep Jewish people who are becoming older and can't get to the shuls anymore? But we should figure out a way of getting them there. What are we doing in our schools to try to ensure that families and kids feel like they're welcome? What do we do in looking at the liturgy, which is one of the reasons why I'm so excited that there are these growing number of Jewish rabbis who are really learned and can really sit down with people like yourself as scholars and go over how disability is represented in the Torah and other places, to really be able to have some, I think, very important discussions. It's the most basic thing of, are you asking people to stand? Are you virtual and are you using captioning? Do you have sign language interpreters? Do you know where the Jewish disability community is Jewish deaf community is. What are people getting? Are you in line with the movement that's really looking at inclusion, and are you willing to listen? And are you willing to make changes? And how do you work with your boards? And, on and on. But I think it's very similar to issues about people from Jews from the LGBTQ community, Jews of color. Rabbi Gil Steinloff, I think, is a very good guy to talk to. He was the rabbi at Addis for a number of years, and he's been doing work looking at Jews from those different communities. I just think let's talk about it. Let's be open about it. And let's really look inwardly at what our biases are. I think that's really important. Advocating for, supporting legislation at the city and state and federal levels that allow people to stay in their home, be active when there are demonstrations going on in New York because they're building subway systems that are not compliant. Have disability as something which people see that is a part of your agenda. I think that's really fundamental.
Judy, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time.